Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and production of this episode was made possible by a grant from the Roller Baltimore Foundation of Richmond, Virginia. Hello, and welcome to episode 282 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Between 1760 and 1761, Great Britain witnessed one of the largest slave insurrections in the history of its empire. Now, although this revolt took place on the island of Jamaica, the reverberations of this revolt stretched across the Atlantic Ocean and into the British North American colonies. Vincent Brown, the Charles Warren Professor of American History and a professor of African American Studies at Harvard University, joins us to investigate this event known as Tacky's Revolt, and how this revolt served as an eddy within the larger current of Atlantic warfare. And he plans to do all of this with details from his book, Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war. Now, during our investigation, Vincent reveals why we need to understand the 18th century politics, warfare, and slave trade of Africa to understand the events in the larger 18th century Atlantic world, why Jamaica grew to become Great Britain's most profitable Atlantic colony, and why its sugar plantations came to rely on enslaved labor, and details about Tacky's Revolt and the ways in which this revolt interconnected with 4 different Atlantic wars. But first, it takes a lot of time and resources to produce Ben Franklin's World, and the Omohundro Institute and I could really use your help to keep it going, which is why we're asking you to support Ben Franklin's World by joining our new subscription program, benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. For less than you would typically pay to visit your favorite museum each month, you can help us deliver several thought-provoking conversations with today's top historians. Plus, subscribers to our subscription program will not only receive a bonus episode on the last Friday of each month, going forward, they'll never have to hear another mid-roll ad again. So become a subscriber, join our subscription program, benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe, and help us continue to bring exciting new historical scholarship right to your ears. Join us at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Okay, are you ready to investigate the details of Great Britain's largest slave insurrection? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a Charles Warren Professor of American History and a Professor of African American Studies at Harvard University. He teaches courses in Atlantic History, African Diaspora Studies, and the history of slavery in the Americas. He's the author of 2 books, including The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, and, most recently, Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Vincent Brown.
Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for having me on.
So, Vincent, at the outset of your book, Tacky's Revolt, you note that the 1760 to 1761 slave insurgency in Jamaica, which is largely what we're going to talk about today, was part of 4 interconnected wars. Now, before we get into those interconnections, I wonder if you can help us better understand the context of the revolt. You mentioned that Africa played a big role in Tacky's Revolt. So would you tell us what was going on in Africa during the 1750s and 1760s, and why it seems like so many of the enslaved people in the Caribbean and the Americas seem to come from the west coast of Africa?
Yeah, that's a great question, Liz. I start the book actually in Africa as opposed to in Jamaica, where the slave revolt of 1760 and 61 occurred, in part because, Caribbeanists certainly know that about 90% of the population of Jamaica, which was at the time Great Britain's most profitable, most militarily significant, and best politically connected colony in the Americas, about 90% of that population was enslaved. And anywhere from half to 3/4 of the enslaved population had been born in Africa. So I figured I should start with the experience of those people and start the story really in West Africa, where many of them came from. Now, I was studying this revolt, which was staged by what were called Coromantee people. Those were mostly Akan, Ga, Adangme speakers from what was then called the Gold Coast, roughly what's now Ghana. And these people became notorious in the late 17th century through the first 3/4 of the 18th century for staging plantation revolts. So they were called Coromantese, and people understood Coromantese as people who were particularly dangerous to have on their plantations. They staged a number of revolts from Suriname all the way up to New York City, with one of the largest of these being in Jamaica in 1760 and 61. So I thought, well, this is a study of warfare that really begins with these people and their experience, and that's how they came to have that reputation. So what was going on in Africa, in part that gave them some military experience, was a particularly war-torn region of the coast. Now, that is how so many people became enslaved in the first place. About half of the people who were captured into the transatlantic slave trade and transported to the Americas had been captured in wars, or had been captured because of the dislocations caused by war on the coast. And there was a symbiotic relationship between warfare in West Africa and the slave trade itself, where oftentimes European traders would trade guns for enslaved people. So that was one of the products that they had that was most in demand, because there were these different struggling polities on the African coast. One of the things they wanted from Europeans was guns. Europeans stimulated those wars with the sale of armaments, and that produced more captive slaves for sale from these wars. What that meant in terms of the experience of those people who'd been enslaved is that far more of them had either been involved in wars or been the victim of wars, stimulated by the slave trade itself. So you can see how that process works. What that also meant, though, is that they didn't just lose that experience when they came to Jamaica. That was something they drew upon when they staged their revolts against plantation society. So already the slave revolt was a war within this larger series of Atlantic wars, within this larger world of warfare that was fundamentally shaped by the slave trade itself. So for me, it became important to see the slave trade as part of the business of war.
You know, one of the really interesting and important points I think you make in your chapter on Africa is that Europeans didn't really get to dictate the slave trade in the ways they would have liked to have dictated that trade. And that while Europeans operated businesses in Africa, they really had to pay attention to and work with, and even work for some of the African empires along Africa's west coast.
Yeah, sure. So the slave trade was fundamentally a trade, but it was also a diplomatic exercise on the part of Europeans. The Europeans didn't control much African territory outside of the Portuguese colony in Angola in West Central Africa. What they had, especially in this area of the Gold Coast, was a series of trading stations, forts, those castles that you can still see if you go to the West African coast, especially to Ghana. And from those trading forts, they would set up negotiations and deals with local African elites for trading relationships. Now, they didn't control the territory, but they had massive resources and connections to Atlantic trade, which helped to give them leverage in their negotiations. So the governors of these forts were told, when you can, intervene in local African diplomatic relations for the benefit of the slave trade, right? So even though they didn't control the trade itself, they were as opportunistic as they could be, drawing on whatever resources they could from European empires to affect the outcome of African diplomatic and political and military struggles in their favor, to the benefit of the slave trade. And so, again, looking at the slave trade and thinking about it as the business of war, it also became the business of diplomacy. It became a story about diplomatic negotiations and military relations, as well as a primarily economic story, which it usually is.
So now that we know a bit about what was going on along the West African coast during the 1750s and 1760s, what was going on in the wider world of European empires? And in what ways did slavery and the slave trade contribute to the formation and the maintaining of those empires?
Well, this speaks to our question about, how this revolt is a war within a series of other wars. So it was not only, as I argue, an outgrowth of conflicts within Africa, where people drew on the military experience they had in African conflicts, but it also took place in the context of European imperial warfare. And so when one thinks about the extension and expansion of Europe into the Americas, military conquest was fundamental to that. The conquest of indigenous territory throughout the Americas. And then competition, military competition between different European powers. So especially in the mid-18th century, we're entering a moment when there's a century-long conflict between Britain and its imperial rivals, most especially France. And so Britain has been fighting France, from the 17th century all the way through the Napoleonic Wars and beyond. And one can't really separate what's happening in the colonies from what's happening in these inter-imperial conflicts. So Tacky's revolt in 1760 and 61 happens smack dab in the middle of the 7 Years' War, which historians often call the First European World War against Britain, France, Spain, and other imperial rivals.
Now, as Vincent's been telling us, the slave trade, empire, warfare, they're all Atlantic phenomena. They occurred in Europe and Africa, and they also occurred in the Caribbean and in North and South America. Vincent, you contend that the Caribbean serves as a great window onto the interconnections between the slave trade, warfare, and empire building, and that the Caribbean is really a place where we can see how 18th century Europe, Africa, and European settlements and markets in the Atlantic world really interacted with each other. Could you tell us a bit about why you think the Caribbean serves as such a great window onto the wider Atlantic world and everything that was going on within it?
Yeah, one reason I think the Caribbean is a great place to focus on the Atlantic and why the Atlantic framework is almost necessary to the study of the Caribbean is the Caribbean is in some ways dependent on its wider networks of Atlantic trade and exchange and military power. These islands, both the Greater Antilles, of which Jamaica is a part, which include Hispaniola, where the Dominican Republic and Haiti are now, Cuba and Jamaica, and the Lesser Antilles, which include places like Barbados and Martinique and Guadeloupe. These places are fundamentally connected through the shipping routes, both to the sources of labor on the Atlantic African coast, but also to the markets in North America and Europe. And they don't really and can't really exist without those wider networks of contacts. But that also situates them principally within the main currents of Atlantic exchange and power. So these Caribbean territories tend to be the most profitable places in the European empires. So Jamaica was far and away the most profitable of the colonies that Great Britain had on the eve of the American Revolution in the Americas, which was 26. So they had 26 American colonies, not 13 as we normally think about. But by far, the most profitable of those were the colonies in the Caribbean. And Jamaica was that principal territory because it was a territory that was turned over wholly to the profit-making enterprise of European planters and merchants. So they were growing principally sugar was the most profitable crop, but also coffee and indigo. And you see some cotton being grown in Saint-Domingue, what later became Haiti. And by the way, Saint-Domingue was France's most profitable colony in the world and the most profitable European colony in the world, just ahead of Jamaica. And so the rules and regulations and policies of these territories are basically in the hands of those wealthy merchants and planters. So this is, the pinnacle of 18th century transatlantic capitalism.
What made Jamaica so valuable in comparison with these other Caribbean colonies during the mid-18th century? Because it sounds like all of these colonies were growing coffee and sugar and perhaps a bit of cotton. So what is it about Jamaica that made it so special as a plantation-based economy?
Yeah, so, sugar. We talk about sugar planting, right, as being about the most profitable enterprise in the 18th century colonial world, and it was. But let's remember that, Barbados had been England's most profitable colony in the 17th century, but Barbados is only about 166 square miles large, and it's relatively flat. And so by the mid-18th century, the soil is becoming exhausted, and the amount of territory that one can turn over to new sugar plantations is constrained. In 1655, again, as part of a campaign against the Spanish Empire in the Americas, England had taken Jamaica from the Spanish. And Jamaica is more than 4,200 square miles large. And it's a variegated territory, mountainous in many regions, not flat like Barbados. And the soil was not exhausted at all because the Spanish had been mostly cattle farming there and not pursuing intensive agriculture. So Jamaica, as a large territory with fresh soil where people could develop new plantations, surpassed Barbados by the second decade of the 18th century and became Britain's most profitable territory, principally because they were growing sugar, but also then because there was more land area available for sale, also because you could fit more workers on that territory. And so Jamaica was Britain's most profitable slave trading entrepot, trading slaves within Jamaica, but also out to the Spanish Empire. There was a lively trade from Kingston down to the Spanish Americas. So there are lots of ways in which people could make money in Jamaica, and that gave it enhanced political power within the metropolis. So you had a lot of people who were planters and merchants with interests in Jamaica, but then were absentee owners living in the United Kingdom or living in Great Britain. And they became influential lobbyists within Parliament, giving Jamaica a special political prominence within the empire.
You mentioned that Jamaica was a much bigger island than Barbados, and it had better soil and much more space to accommodate new plantations and a lot more laborers. When we look at these plantation economies, just how integral was slavery to these sugar and coffee and cotton economies? And why did plantation owners rely so much on enslaved labor instead of hiring free laborers to work on their plantations?
So sugar was really down through the 19th century, almost always grown with enslaved labor. And this goes from, the origins of the sugar plantation complex in the Eastern Mediterranean out to the Atlantic islands off the African coast to Brazil and into the Caribbean and up to Louisiana. Slave labor was the way that people grew sugar. In part, it's because the labor was so intensive, complex because the sugar would rot if you didn't get it very immediately from the fields after it was cut into processing, that one needed a high degree of discipline in order to regiment the sugar workers and keep them on task. So it was incredibly difficult labor, and it was also incredibly exacting labor. And it's the kind of labor that free people just wouldn't do on their own, especially if they weren't making the profits off of this. So you generally tended to have enslaved laborers growing it. And how you got those laborers was you generally imported people who had been dislocated, torn from networks of kin and protection. In the Eastern Mediterranean, many of those laborers came from the Slavic countries. And as we know, the term slave actually is a derivative of Slavs, because the Slavs were the people who were working a lot of the sugar plantations in the Eastern Mediterranean. And as they moved out to the Atlantic, increasingly those plantations came to depend on labor from Africa.
We've talked about the geography of Jamaica, and we've even discussed its economy and the different crops that enslaved people grew to help keep Jamaica a very profitable island. Now I think it's time for us to turn to the society and culture of Jamaica. Because Vincent, it sounds like with all these different migrations that are taking place across the Atlantic, forced or otherwise, that we have a lot of different people living on this island of Jamaica. So would you tell us about the culture and society of the island and what it was like by the 1760s?
Yeah. So Jamaica's need for labor was insatiable, in part because, as I said, sugar was such a difficult crop to grow, so demanding, but also so profitable, that it became more profitable for planters to enslave people, work them to death over the course of 7 to 10 years, and then import more people through the transatlantic slave trade than it was to give them enough kind of food and shelter in order to raise families and reproduce themselves. So wherever you find sugar being grown, and this is, from Brazil up to Louisiana, you find short life expectancy, and you find that enslaved populations are not reproducing themselves by natural growth means. So in any territory kind of grown with sugar, you tended to have majority enslaved populations. And as I said, the population of Jamaica was about 90% enslaved peoples by the mid-18th century. And because the need for those laborers was so insatiable, planters got them from wherever they could. So they drew enslaved laborers from a broad section of the African Atlantic coast, from the Senegal River all the way down to the Zaire River, and even as far around as Madagascar. And so you had incredibly diverse populations of enslaved laborers. And even though they were mostly from Africa, they weren't at all, in any conceivable sense, the same people, right? So these were radically diverse populations. People spoke many different languages. They worshiped many different gods. They recognized different systems of political authority. But where you had concentrations of people, as in the case of the Gold Coast, people could speak each other's language. They understood each other. Maybe they worshiped similar kinds of deities, and they could form new communities, new ethnicities, really, in these territories where all these enslaved people were. And so the Coromantese, as they were called, from the Gold Coast, were people who, as I said, spoke often some form of a Akan language like Twi or related languages. They again recognized similar kinds of religious principles and similar kinds of political symbols. And they organized into this ethnicity Coromantese vis-a-vis other Africans who were from various parts of the coast. And then from within those ethnicities could stage rebellions if they so chose, organizing along those ethnic lines.
Now, we've been setting up a lot of context so that we can talk about the slave insurrection in Jamaica between 1760 and 1761. And I do have one more contextual question for us. Vincent, in your book, Tacky's Revolt, you note that slavery was a form of war, that is an assault upon enslaved people. And I wonder, could you tell us a bit about what you mean by this idea that slavery is a form of war?
So in Orlando Patterson's famous definition of slavery in his major work, Slavery and Social Death, he defines slavery as the permanent, violent domination of generally dishonored and natally alienated persons. So a lot of people have focused on a natal alienation, right? People don't actually kind of determine their own lineages, right? If they're enslaved, as a form of social death. And people have kind of taken that definition of slavery to be paramount. But I think the permanent violent domination part is almost more important, right? The only way you can subject people to an owner's will, to a master's will, to a slaveholder's will, is through that violence, that violent domination. Now, this is widely recognized at the time. The philosopher John Locke, who we kind of know as the philosopher of freedom, actually said, what is slavery? But the state of conquest continued between a lawful conqueror and his captive. Now, Locke is actually trying to think about how slavery can be legitimated. He is an investor in the Royal African Company trading with slaves, and he also helps to write the fundamental constitution of the colony of South Carolina, which becomes the preeminent slave colony in North America. But later on, Olaudah Equiano, Gustavus Vasa, who writes the most famous kind of early autobiography from the perspective of a formerly enslaved person and becomes a major abolitionist and celebrated writer in 18th century Britain, also says, when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. And he's not being metaphorical, and he's not trying to legitimate slavery. What he's saying is the actual condition of being enslaved is something where that permanent violence is met often by a counterforce of some kind. And certainly in a territory like Jamaica, where 90% of the population is enslaved, where you have large ethnic groups from particular parts of the coast, and where they haven't experienced fighting wars, they can meet the violent domination of the enslavers with a military response of their own. And that's what I'm trying to write about here in Tacky's Revolt.
We have a lot of context in place, don't we? We know that the slave trade was part of the business of war and also part of the business of diplomacy. We've seen how Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean were all connected in the slave trade. So I think it's now time to turn to the insurrection in Jamaica. But before we do that, let's take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. One of the lessons I think we're picking up from our conversation with Vincent is that early America was a very complicated place. And part of that complexity comes from the many ways in which British North America and the Caribbean were connected to the wider worlds of Africa and Europe. Now, undoubtedly, the interconnected nature of the Atlantic world helped foster the sharing and spread of information over Atlantic sea routes. Of course, today, we don't have to wait for a ship to carry our information to friends, family, or business associates across an ocean. We can simply contact them and connect with them through email. SaneBox is a tool that will help us with our email. SaneBox helps those who are inundated with email see and respond to messages that matter most. SaneBox is a service that automatically sorts your email using your preferred email service provider. So you don't have to change any of your habits by creating a new email account or downloading a new app. SaneBox just makes your existing email service more awesome. So how does SaneBox do this? How does it make your existing email service more awesome? Well, as a SaneBox customer for the last 3 years, I can tell you that as messages flow into your inbox, SaneBox places your most important emails in your inbox and then directs all other emails into your Sane Later folder. SaneBox makes sure that you see your most important messages first, and then it saves all those other emails for when you have time to sort through and read them. Plus, SaneBox also has a nifty feature called the Sane Black Hole. I really love this tool because it makes unsubscribing from newsletters or sales ads really easy. When you come across a newsletter, ad, or even a sender you no longer wish to receive messages from, just drag and drop that unwanted message into your Sane Black Hole folder, and SaneBox will make sure that you never hear from those senders again. I also really like the Sane Reminders feature. Have you ever sent an email with an important question and then forgotten the email as you were working on other things? SaneBox helps ensure that these unresponded emails don't fall through the cracks. In 2 to 3 days, SaneBox returns that unreplied email into your inbox so you can decide whether or not you need to follow up on it. I really love SaneBox, and you can try SaneBox for yourself with a free 2-week trial. Visit sanebox.com/bfworld today to start your free trial and get a $25 credit. That's sanebox.com/bfworld. sanebox.com/bfworld. Vincent, how were the seeds of this 1760-1761 slave insurrection in Jamaica germinated in Africa? Could you tell us a bit more about the military cultures of Africa's west coast and how these military cultures combined with African disputes to fuel a war and revolt in Jamaica?
Yeah, so I talked generally about how the Gold Coast was a particularly war-torn region of the coast, and I could say a little bit more about that here, which is that in the mid to late 17th century, there was a kind of military revolution in the Gold Coast, with a number of different African polities vying for supremacy. And as I said, often importing European firearms as part of those struggles. That actually increased the scale of warfare on the Gold Coast. And a number of major empires like Dinshira, Akwamu, Akim, and most famous among them, Ashanti, that contended with a confederation of Fante peoples along the coast, maintained a number of major struggles alongside smaller polities in the region that occurred through the late 17th to the mid to late 18th century. And out of that warfare, as I said, produced vast quantities of enslaved peoples for sale to the Europeans on the coast, but also gave people an experience with that kind of fighting. So it was really the military revolution in the late 17th century that helped to spur the kind of militarism of these major African states and also gave military experience to these people who came out to Jamaica. And what I'm arguing in the book is that Tacky's Revolt is in some way a continuation of those kinds of struggles. Many of the people who were captured in those wars had been soldiers, as I said.
What were the logistics of organizing and staging a slave insurrection in Jamaica? Like, what elements did enslaved people need to put together in order to have a real shot at starting and succeeding in a big revolt?
Yeah, well, the first thing and most important thing is you have to be able to communicate with people. And that's why kind of where people were drawn from in Africa, what languages they spoke, and what cultural practices they shared was so important. Because in order to maintain kind of relations of trust, one has to be able to find people that you can communicate with and that you can build some sort of alliance with, seal some sort of pact with. So that's why it's so important to think about where these people are coming from and what kinds of experiences they have and might have shared. In addition to being able to communicate and build relations of trust through which one could form an alliance or a conspiracy, one also has to find opportunities within the plantation regime to organize and coordinate. So you have these armies of workers, especially on sugar plantations, working together, being led by drivers who are themselves generally enslaved. Now, those drivers can play a kind of dual role. And the historian Randy Brown is now writing what I think is going to be an excellent book on this. They both are in some ways responsible for keeping good working order and discipline among the enslaved population for the benefit of the slaveholders. But that gives them a certain kind of authority, which, if and when they decide to organize a rebellion, they can use as leaders of revolt. And so you find that Tacky himself and other leaders of the revolt that I've found had been drivers on various plantations. So not only could they organize along ethnic lines, they also had certain social roles in the plantation economy that allowed them leadership capacity and organizing capacity as well. Now, as part of the effort to stitch this conspiracy across space, you needed to depend on people who were mobile, not just people who stayed on plantations, but all of those people doing jobs that required them to move from plantation to plantation. And again, if 90% of the population is enslaved people are doing all the work. So they're doing all the transportation of goods between plantations. And that actually is a communication network as well. And then finally, the geography of Jamaica plays a major role too. On an island like Barbados that was thoroughly cultivated and largely flat by the mid-18th century, there aren't as many possibilities for evasion and escape as there are on a territory like Jamaica, which is mountainous and more of it is uncultivated. So you find that people can leave plantations for short periods of time without being seen, sometimes without being noticed, or even long periods of time without being found. There was also a large maroon presence of people who had permanently escaped plantations and fought a series of wars against the British that could be conduits for that kind of communication as well. Now, we'll get into the diplomatic negotiations that enslaved people had to conduct with formerly enslaved people called Maroons in order to stage their revolts. But that is to say, this is largely a political process that has to be conceived as a hard-won, carefully thought out, moment-by-moment incremental process of political organizing. One can't know just from who the Africans were, where they were from, or the fact that they were enslaved, how these revolts would play out. One has to, as best as one can, given the limitations of the sources, think through what the politics of the enslaved are.
It also sounds like this is a very dangerous business to organize a slave revolt, because you are looking to build trust and for people you can trust. And you're also trying to look at the different political situations around you, the politics among different enslaved people, the politics among planters. And it really just seems like you would have to go out on a limb to talk to anyone about a possible slave insurrection before you were even going to start one. So you might need to communicate with these people weeks or months in advance.
Oh, yeah. When I say that slavery was a condition of permanent violent domination, I'm not joking. First of all, these kind of relations of domination were maintained through the constant threat of violence and often the practice of violence, insults, threats, beatings, rapes. That was a continuous part of the enslavement experience. Also, when there were rebellions, and even small-scale rebellions, even individual acts of resistance, the consequences, the punishments could be quite extreme. I mean, we're talking about ghastly things like people's heads being severed and put on poles. And those kind of icons would stay on and around plantations for years and years and years. So kind of most large plantations would have these kind of markers of what would happen when people were enslaved that would be up and around for years as warnings to people against what would happen to you if you disobeyed plantation authority. The violence was extreme. And so anybody plotting against slavery had to be extremely careful.
Now, what we know as Tacky's Revolt actually took place throughout Jamaica between 1760 and 1761. Vincent, would you tell us about the launch of this revolt and how the opening salvo of Tacky's Revolt connected with the larger rebellion that took place across the island of Jamaica?
Okay, so here's where things get murky and where there's a lot of guesswork and speculation, but I try to do it as responsibly as possible given the sources that we have. We know that the outbreak of the revolt in 1760 started on the night of April 7th, morning of April 8th in 1760 in the parish of St. Mary's, where Africans first attacked Fort Haldane, which was a small, lightly defended fort on the north coast of Jamaica. From there, they killed the sentry. They took whatever weapons they could and ammunition they could, and then they went up through the main heart of the plantation parish, attacking plantations and burning plantations along the way, hoping to gather other forces to their side. At that point, they were attacked by the militia, which consisted mostly of those kind of overseers and what were called bookkeepers and white laborers on these plantations that were required to join the militia and suppress these slave revolts. But generally, the militia fared poorly against these African rebels. And it wasn't until the formal British military was brought in, the British Army and even the Royal Navy, as well as the Maroons, who had, in 1739, after major campaigns against the British, had signed treaties which required them, in order to maintain their own autonomy, to police future slave revolts, which they did. So British authorities called upon the Maroons to supplement the British Army and the Royal Navy and the militia to help suppress these revolts. The revolt in the parish of St. Mary, that was led by this man we identify as Tacky, only lasted a couple of weeks before it was suppressed by this combination of British forces. But then there were other small revolts across the island. And then on May 25th, there was a much larger revolt in the parish of Westmoreland, to the south and to the west of the parish of St. Mary, that lasted throughout 1760 and then on into 1761. And that revolt was led by somebody else, we think, a man named Wager, who had had an African name, Opongo. And that was a much larger campaign in what was at the time a much richer and more profitable parish. And you had the same combination of British forces, only on a much larger scale, suppressing that revolt on the western side of the island.
Now, what made the revolt led by Wager or Pongo in this larger Coromantee War, which is how you call this revolt in your book, Tacky's Revolt? What made this larger rebellion more resistant to being put down than the revolt in St. Mary's Parish that was led by Tacky?
It's a great question, and it requires me to go back and talk about the title of the book, really. I titled it Tacky's Revolt because that's the name we have for the revolt that was given to us by the first people who wrote histories of the event, the planter Edward Long and the planter Brian Edwards. They identified Tacky as a principal leader, and ever since it's been known as Tacky's Revolt. And there's even a movement now to name Tacky as a national hero in Jamaica, led, in part by an activist named Derek Black X Robinson, who's been campaigning for years and years to have Tacky recognized as a national hero. Now, I started researching Tacky and found that there were also many other leaders that may have been just as important or even more important than Tacky in the campaigning of this revolt. And one of those leaders was this man named Wager, also known as Opongo, who led the revolt, the larger revolt, in Westmoreland Parish. So in some ways, for my story, Tacky's Revolt is kind of in scare quotes, right? It's the name we have, but I'm not sure if Tacky's Revolt isn't part of, as I said, a much larger Coromantee War, or I think it frankly is. Now, Wager himself emerges in the diary of a plantation overseer named Thomas Thistlewood, who was for about 36 years in Jamaica and left a very detailed diary of his experiences there. And in that diary, after the fact, he says that this man Wager, also known as Opongo, had been a military official in West Africa, where he encountered the former chief agent of Cape Coast Castle, a man named John Cope Sr. Thistlewood actually works for John Cope Sr.'s son, John Cope Jr. And so he hears the story from John Cope Jr. Now, Opongo had been accustomed to trading with John Cope Sr. Thistlewood mentions that he goes to Cape Coast Castle, which is Britain's principal fort on the Gold Coast, with a guard of about 100 people. Now, John Cope Sr. retires from Cape Coast Castle after about 4 or 5 years trading there and sets himself up with a plantation in Jamaica. Some years later, Opongo is himself captured, sold to the Europeans, transported to Jamaica, where he again encounters John Cope Sr., who lays out a tablecloth for him for Sunday visits and treats Opongo as a man of honor, even though he's now enslaved. And John Cope Sr. insinuates that, when your master comes back to the island, and Opongo's owner is a Royal Navy ship captain named Arthur Forrest, who had renamed Opongo Wager after one of his ships. When your owner, Arthur Forrest, comes back to the island, John Cope Sr. says, I'll have you redeemed and sent home. Now, John Cope dies in 1756, just weeks before we know that Arthur Forrest returns to Jamaica. And sometime in the intervening 4 years, between 56 and 60, Wager becomes one of the leaders of this largest slave revolt in the history of the 18th century British Empire. So this suggests that this is a way of looking at this revolt, which is not just about slaves revolting against masters in a local environment, but a transatlantic war where people might have known each other, and certainly did in this case, on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Once I reconceived the war that way, not just as a kind of local revolt in a single parish that might have spread to others, but as a transatlantic affair, I began to see that it was a transatlantic affair for the British as well. When the British suppressed the revolt, they used many of the sailors and Marines who had fought in other campaigns around the Atlantic world. So there was one particular ship, HMS Harwich, which had just a year and a half, 2 years previous to Tacky's revolt, been involved in the conquest of Senegal during the 7 Years' War, and then came to the Caribbean. And the next major mission of those sailors and Marines was to suppress Tacky's revolt. There had also been soldiers and sailors who had been involved in battles in Martinique and Guadeloupe and Quebec that came to Jamaica to suppress Tacky's revolt. So again, this was for both sides part of a much wider war than it usually is when we conceive it as Tacky's revolt in the parish of St. Mary. That's why I call it an Atlantic slave war. And the fact that Coromantese were at the heart of this is why I think that that Atlantic slave war, in this instance, is described best by the term Coromantee War.
How did this Coromantee War play out in Jamaica, and what were the reverberations of this war?
Yeah, so as I said, it played out over the course of more than a year. It was a very hard-fought campaign, and when you kind of look back at the 7 Years' War, it turns out to have been one of the harder-fought battles of the 7 Years' War, even though most 7 Years' War historians don't really conceive it as part of the 7 Years' War. This is something that emerged, I think, most forcefully in the work of a young historian named Maria Alessandra Ballatino, who firmly situated this revolt in the 7 Years' War. And I think ever after, we should see it really as part of the 7 Years' War, as well as a part of these other campaigns around the Atlantic world. Eventually, the British did suppress it, however, using that combination of forces that I described earlier. And one has to say that the enslaved lost their campaign. And yet their legacies reverberated very widely, both within Jamaica and beyond. Now, we know that news of this revolt circulated around the empire. Reports were published in the Pennsylvania Gazette quite regularly, and that turns out to be one of our major sources on the progress of the revolt. And then you find, in its wake, colonial legislatures passing special taxes on the import of slaves directly from Africa. They already had duties on the import of slaves from the Caribbean because they knew that oftentimes Caribbean planters would try to export people who'd been involved in rebellions. If they didn't execute them, they would exile them, and they would try to essentially pass them off on planters in North America. So there were duties on enslaved peoples coming in from the Caribbean, and then special duties passed in the 1760s on enslaved laborers from Africa. What this turned out to be were some of the earliest restrictions on slave trading in other American colonies, stimulated by that fear of revolting Africans coming into their colonies. You also had waves of sympathy, in fact, from British persons who were almost more aghast at the spectacular punishments and ghastly and grisly massacres committed by British forces, that they wondered what this meant in terms of the soul of the British Empire, right? Whether or not Britain was going to be a force for good in the world if this is the way the colonies work. And that also helped to stimulate the anti-slave trade movement in the metropolis.
Given that we see these early restrictions imposed on the slave trade with these special taxes and duties placed on the importation of enslaved people, was there even a market for enslaved people who had been involved with this rebellion or with any sort of slave insurrection?
Yeah, that was often a kind of clandestine market, right? So as I said, about 500 people that we know of were killed summarily. Enslaved people were killed during the course of the rebellion. At least 500 more were what they called transported, exiled as their punishment from the island. Again, kind of tearing them away from whatever networks of kin and care they had managed to build in Jamaica, and again, kind of launching them out into the world. Now, we can trace some of these people out to a territory like British Honduras, which is what's now Belize, and some of those people were involved in rebellions in British Honduras. We also know that at least one full ship of exiled slaves went to Virginia. We don't know what happened when they got there, in part because people were not keen to declare that they were buying or importing people who had just been involved in a slave rebellion. They also didn't want to pay the taxes, the special taxes on people from the Caribbean. So you find this illicit market of trying to kind of pass off these people from the Caribbean who may have been involved in revolts into other Caribbean and North American markets.
Do we know anything about what the lives were like for these people who were shipped out of Jamaica and to places like Virginia? Were they able to form new communities in places like Virginia or British Honduras?
Well, it's a great question, and we don't have great answers to it. We know that certainly they tried. That one of the kind of most awful things about slavery, aside from the violence, or maybe as part of the violence, was the serial displacement and dispossession and alienation, the kind of constantly being torn from, as I said, whatever networks of friendship and kin and care you managed to build within slave societies. And so that was a serious punishment. So the most active thing they would have tried to do is, again, find people they could trust, find people who could help them survive. And they had to do that again in those new territories where they find themselves, including, as I said, in Virginia, which I might add kind of connects up what's happening in the Caribbean with the descendants of those people in the Virginia colonies.
Now, Stessa has a question about how news of the 1760-1761 slave insurgency would have spread in both Jamaica and in North America. Specifically, she'd like to know whether there's any evidence that people transmitted stories of this slave rebellion through songs or other fictional tales.
I love this question, in part because one of the things I was trying to do was really, as I said, take enslaved politics seriously and think about those circuits of news and information that traveled among the enslaved. I was inspired in that by a book by a man named Julius Scott called The Common Wind, which is about currents of communication during the era of the Haitian Revolution, which came after Tacky's Revolt. So kind of with this in my mind, in the 6th chapter of the book, I try to trace out these exiles and think about, even where I have to imagine what kinds of stories they told to others. As I said, I don't know what happened in Virginia when those people got there, but I know they got there, and I know they carried with them information on what had happened in Jamaica and told that story in one way or another to the people that they were trying to make friends and kin with. But more specifically than that, we know that much later, the story of Tacky's Revolt and the other revolts of the Coromantee War were still being told in Jamaica. And this emerges in the letters of a planter named Simon Taylor, who in the early 19th century writes that he had imported some laborers from Africa, some slaves from Africa, and they came to this plantation that he managed in the parish of St. Mary. And then they rose up and attempted to stab their driver. So he wanted to figure out what was going on. So he apprehended them. He interrogated them, perhaps under torture. And he found out that they all knew about the insurrections that had happened in the 1760s. Now, these are people who had just come to the island from Africa. And he said, they must have been planning something. Otherwise, how would they have known about insurrections that happened 40 years ago before any of the slaves on this plantation were born? So what that suggests is that they were teaching and learning a subaltern political history on the island of Jamaica, that they were teaching it to brand new people who came to the island. That to me is fascinating because it suggests not just that they carried news of what was happening now, but news of what had happened before, that there's a historical consciousness to slave revolt among the enslaved. That's something historians really haven't accounted for and haven't spent much time thinking about.
Now, at the start of our conversation today, I mentioned that At the outset of Vincent's book, Tacky's Revolt, Vincent notes that the 1760 to 1761 slave insurgency in Jamaica was part of 4 interconnected wars. Vincent, now that we know all about the interconnectedness of the Atlantic world and the details of the Jamaican slave insurgency, would you bring it all together for us and tell us how the slave insurgency was part of 4 interconnected wars?
Great. So that allows a kind of summary of the framework for the book. There are a lot of connected parts in this book. It's a very kind of complex and dynamic story. And in order to understand how things were playing out on this broad canvas that encompassed the entire Atlantic world, I needed to map things. And so, as I say, I mapped wars within wars and how they connected to each other. So the slave revolt itself could be considered a race war because the enslaved were mostly black and the planters and slaveholders were mostly white. But it also was part of an imperial war between Britain and France and Britain's other imperial rivals. And as part of that imperial war, it was part of the 7 Years' War. It also was an outgrowth of the slaving wars that produced captives for sale into the slave trade in Africa, as I alluded to earlier. And then finally, there were communal struggles among the enslaved themselves that can be considered a kind of war, because not all of the struggles that happened within Africa ended when people came to Jamaica. They transformed, but there were still conflicts among the enslaved that have to be accounted for if one wants to think about how the politics of slave revolt played out. So again, 4 different kinds of wars: race war, imperial war, slaving war, and communal war have to be mapped in order to understand how this slave revolt can be really an eddy within this larger current of transatlantic warfare.
And now it is time for the Time Warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if Tacky's Revolt and the larger Coromantee War had been successful? How might early American history and the practice of slavery in North America and the Caribbean have played out differently?
Well, it's a fun question. Again, none of these speculations could be verified, but we have the example of the Haitian Revolution, which occurred 3 decades later. And had Britain fared worse in the course of the 7 Years' War, and had the political ruling class cracked up in some degree, like the ruling class in France and Saint-Domingue did during the French Revolution, the enslaved might have won. They might have taken the island. This was the most serious threat to the British territory before the American Revolution that began in the 1770s, but certainly the most serious threat posed to Britain by enslaved peoples. And so one might have imagined a different kind of polity in Jamaica than obtained there. And that might have had its knock-on reverberations for the course of the American Revolution as well. Had Britain already lost its most profitable, most militarily significant, and best politically connected colony, we don't know what the territory in North America might have looked like a decade and a half, 2 decades later. We know that in the context of the Haitian Revolution, Napoleon's plans for reconquering the Louisiana territory in North America were given up because he intended to use the reconquered colony of Saint-Domingue as a base from which to reestablish the French Empire in North America. Because Napoleon lost the Haitian Revolution, he sold the Louisiana Purchase territory to Thomas Jefferson, and the United States could therefore expand. So just imagine what might have happened had Britain lost its most profitable colony in the 1760s. North American history might have been different. Hard to predict how different, because something else would have changed. And as I try to show in this book, things are so dynamic, they can be plotted as carefully as possible, but it's very hard to predict how these patterns would play out when there are so many moving parts and so many of them are consequential.
And this is why we have the Time Warp section in so many of our episodes, so that we have a chance to show the contingency that's involved in history, that Nothing in history was inevitable.
Yeah.
So now that you've written about Tacky's Revolt and the larger Coromantee War, what aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Well, I'm doing a couple of different things. The next book I want to write is a kind of larger synthetic history of the African diaspora, which illustrates how it is that people formed communities and created cultures as a response to their dispossession and alienation and migration. So really from before the era of the slave trade all the way through the present, I want to think about how it is that these Africans and their descendants have built new communities and how those have shaped visions for the future and visions for alliances across the world. So the research for that book is just beginning now. I'm also working on a little series of short films, probably 10-minute short films, on different historical images. So we're taking as a first series photographs that are kind of iconic and then exploring the history of those photographs, showing how, say, an iconic photograph like Alfred Stieglitz's photograph, The Steerage, that seems to show the history of migration to the Americas is different when you look at the history of how that photograph was taken. And in fact, in that photograph, The Steerage, those migrants were going away from Ellis Island, not coming to America. And that changes our perception of migration in its early period and maybe changes our perception of how migration works in the United States more generally. So that's a series that I'm looking for development funds for now that we hope to have that finished sometime next year.
Is there a place where we can look for more information about you, your work, and how we can get in contact with you if we have more questions about the slave insurgency in Jamaica?
Sure. So the best way is through the Harvard History Department website. But also I have a little unit called the History Design Studio at Harvard, where more information on media projects that I've been engaged with can be found. It's a studio where we're trying to think about how it is that one works historically, does history in media beyond text and print. So how is it that we make historical truth claims when the finished form of our work is not an academic article or not a print book, but maybe a podcast or a film or a sound installation or a live performance? That's where we really do that work to think about how it is we're going to tell the truth about history when we're not necessarily writing it down.
Vincent Brown, thank you so much for joining us and for taking us through the Coromantee War and the 1760-1761 slave insurrection in Jamaica.
Thanks so much, Liz. It's been a fun conversation.
The slave insurrection known as Tacky's Revolt stands as one of the largest slave insurrections in Great Britain's history. It's an event that shows us an extent to which enslaved people worked to resist slavery, and it is also an event that shows us the interconnected nature of the Atlantic world. Now, if we zoom in on Tacky's Revolt, we can see that it was a race war, as most of its enslaved participants were Africans or of African descent, while its free participants were mostly white. Now, if we zoom out from the event, we can see that Tacky's Revolt was also part of European and African imperial warfare. As Vincent noted, the slave trade was not just a matter of trade and business, but also part of the political and military histories of Africa's Atlantic coast peoples and the European peoples they interacted with. Now, if we keep this broader context in mind, when we look at Tacky's Revolt, we can see how the slave trade caused conflict and communal strife, which enslaved people then brought with them across the Atlantic to the Americas and to the Caribbean during their forced migration from Africa. I know, it's as Vincent said, this is a story with a lot of moving parts. But by considering the 1760-1761 slave insurgency in Jamaica within these larger contexts, we can really see how Great Britain's 26 Atlantic colonies fit within the larger worlds of European and African economy, diplomacy, and warfare. We can see how the colonies fit within the larger Atlantic slave trade. And we can see that the British Atlantic colonies were not isolated from the rest of the world, but very much a part of this larger Atlantic space. You'll find more information about Vincent, his book, Tacky's Revolt, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/282. See how SaneBox can magically remove distractions from your inbox with a 2-week free trial and a $25 credit. Visit sanebox.com/bfworld. That's sanebox.com/bfworld. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, Karen Wolf, and Peyton Young. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, do you see any other events that would allow us to see aspects of early America and its interconnectedness with other people and places in a new light? I'm curious what you see, so please send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and production of this episode was made possible by a grant from the Roller Baltimore Foundation of Richmond, Virginia.